Hello Year Ones, it's Friday story time and I've chosen a book all about foxes. It's called The Very Noisy Foxes by Amy Husband, and I chose it because one of your homework challenges is to find out about animals that are nocturnal. That means they're awake during the night. So The Very Noisy Foxes. Have you ever seen a fox? In a very noisy house, in a very noisy city, lived 3 noisy foxes. And it looks very noisy because there's an ambulance going past, there's people on telephones. So it looks like a very noisy city. They spent all day being very noisy, mixing, fixing, hopping and bopping, banging and clanging. "Wouldn't it be nice to be quiet sometimes?" asked fox number 1. "Perhaps we should move to the countryside," suggested fox number 2. "What a good idea," replied fox number 3. Because look, they're shouting to each other through loudspeakers. They are very noisy. And look, they're going on a very noisy bus now. So they packed up all of their very noisy things and caught the very noisy bus to find a place to live in the very quiet countryside. Do you think they'll like it in the quiet countryside? Let's find out. In a very quiet wood, in the very quiet countryside, they met an owl. "Twit, twoo, who are you?" hooted the owl. "We're from the very noisy city, looking for a quiet place to live," replied fox number 1. "Where do you live, owl?" "I live up here at the top of this very tall, quiet tree," said the owl. "Oh, yes, it is very quiet, but it's too high for us," said fox number 1. "We're scared." Next, in a very quiet meadow, in the very quiet countryside, the noisy foxes met a mole, who popped up out of the ground. "Hello, mole! We're from the very noisy city, looking for a quiet place to live. Can you help us?" asked fox number 2. "Oh, yes, I live in a very quiet place," replied the mole. "Follow me and I'll show you." You remember when we read the book about the fox, the mole, the horse and the boy? There's the mole. "I live here in this very quiet hole underground," said the mole. "Oh, yes, it is very quiet, but it's too dark for us," said fox number 2. "We can't see." In a very quiet clearing, in the very quiet countryside, the noisy foxes met a frog. "Ribbit, ribbit, what do you 3 noisy foxes want?" the frog asked. "We're looking for a quiet place to live," said fox number 3. "Where do you live, frog?" "Come with me and I'll show you, ribbit," replied the frog. "I live here in this very quiet pond," said the frog. "Oh, yes, it is very quiet indeed, but it's too wet for us," said fox number 3, "and we can't swim." So the 3 noisy foxes kept searching for a very, very long time, and they ended up in the very quietest part of the countryside, a long, long way from the very noisy city. As they ventured along the very quiet path, they met a badger. "Hello, badger! We're looking for a quiet place to live," said the noisy foxes. "Can you help us? We've looked everywhere." "Yes, of course. Follow me," replied the badger. "This is where I live," said the badger. "It is the quietest place in all of the countryside." "Oh, yes, it is really very quiet and very lovely. It might just be the perfect place," said the noisy foxes. "But," It's just too quiet. What do you think the foxes are going to do? The noisy foxes were really fed up with being quiet, so they started to make some noise. As they banged and clanged and chittered and chattered, a quiet little mouse scurried up to them. "What is all this noise all about?" asked the quiet little mouse. "We need a place to live, but it can't be too high, it can't be too dark, and it can't be too wet, and it definitely can't be too quiet," replied the noisy foxes. "I know the perfect place," squeaked the mouse. "Follow me." Oh, I wonder where the mouse is going to take them. So they're going past the badger, past the frog, past the mole, past the owl. Oh, and they're going to get on a bus. I wonder where they're going to go to. Shall we see? Well done, little mouse. This really is the perfect place. And they're back at the city, the very noisy city. So that's the story of the very noisy foxes. Bye-bye.